A fine welcome to all. May you have a good time. Let me say a few words, and I'll say them in rhyme. To the Institute's friends from both near and from far, Shalom, buenos dias, cheerio, and bonsoir. Our Institute's old, we are 80. Our founders brought wisdom and wit now and then. Our leaders were wise. They would teach, they would sermon, and most of you know our old coach, David Turman. Let me welcome our teachers. They are truly marquee, and best for the budget, they're teaching for free. All our classes are splendid, I'm sure you'd agree, so come for the learning, if not a degree. There are classes and clinics to choreograph, and to keep it all running, we have a fine staff. Let us welcome the candidates. Some are new, some returning. You are masters of Zoom. You've achieved distance learning. You now span the globe. It's not just America, but hold your applause till we hear more from Erica. Let us welcome alumni who are best at explaining the virtue and value of Institute training. You come to our programs with fabulous panelists, deep thinkers and intellects, most of them analysts. It's been 2 years and more since COVID exploded, and who could have guessed what that virus foreboded? We saw heroes and helpers who jumped in as soon as they learned of a need. We thank Dorothy Grunas. I could go on, extolling and praising, but it's my role tonight to speak of fundraising. Please open your wallets, do not all be cynics. So much help we can do for our fine treatment clinics. I know trolling for dollars will leave you annoyed. It's as welcome as shingles or a sore hemorrhoid, but the ask is a task that must be employed. So much good we can do, so much grief to avoid. Relying on donors, we pray for an heiress who can sponsor a grant for a class or Bar Harris. Please give your support for our work if you're able, and help us become much more fiscally stable.
Thank you, David. As you can all see, David is not only our board chair, he is also our poet in residence. It has been my honor to be president of the Chicago Institute for the past 8.5 years. In that time, I've had the opportunity to work with our amazing faculty, our curious, engaged students, our staff who make so much possible, and our very committed Board of Trustees. But one of the best parts of my job is welcoming people to the Institute, and that's what I'm going to be doing for you this evening, or afternoon or morning, depending on where you are geographically. But for you, our virtual audience, I want to welcome you all to the Institute's 2022 annual benefit. This benefit is extra special because we're celebrating our 90th anniversary this year. Our theme is honoring the past, building the future. And as someone whose hobby is investigating the history of psychoanalysis, I can assure you that there are many interesting twists and turns in our history that will help illuminate our present. Tonight, we will be taking a historical look at the story of the Institute and how we came to be who we are today. This is a quintessentially psychoanalytic theme. After all, psychoanalysis is a theory of the mind and a therapeutic intervention, but it's all about the way our personal history contributes to our present and leads to our future. It is an axiom of psychoanalysis that the better we know and understand our history, the more able we are to create the kind of present and future that ensures we can achieve our goals. I think that goes for us as individuals and for us as an organization. Since 1932, the mission of the Institute has been a dual one, to provide education and to provide clinical services. Through our education programs, we train psychoanalysts and psychotherapists to provide the kind of skillful help that enables people to change their lives in ways not possible otherwise. We know that there are many outside the mental health field as well who are interested in psychoanalytic thought, and we educate them as well. Our student group, I am proud to say, comes from around the globe, and we integrate them into our classroom using Zoom technology, which we've been doing since pre-pandemic years. China, New Zealand, Bulgaria, Saudi Arabia, these are some of the countries where our students reside. It makes for a very exciting learning community. Now, our clinical services look somewhat different than they did in 1932, but they have the same goal of offering psychoanalytically informed therapy on a sliding scale or fee-adjusted basis to ensure access to high-quality mental health services. Under the auspices of our treatment center, our clinical staff sees adults, adolescents, and children for therapy. We offer specialized services for children who have suffered the loss of a parent or caregiver through our child grief services. We have a schools initiative with therapists on site in Chicago area public and charter schools offering both group work and individual therapy to students, work which is entirely donor and foundation supported. At the initiative of one of our faculty members, we started a First Responders Project in which volunteer faculty provide 8 pro bono therapy sessions to first responders working during the pandemic. I like to say that our treatment center is our demonstration project. It demonstrates the power and efficacy of what we teach in our education programs and helps people change their lives. All of this is possible because of the support we receive from our donors, the benefit sponsors, the foundations that recognize the value of the work we do, and from you, our benefit attendees. I also want to recognize the very special contributions of our volunteer faculty for their generous in-kind contribution of their expertise in so many ways. For those of you who would like to make a donation this evening, there is a donate button on the screen that you can access at any time. We greatly appreciate your support of our mission.
It's a common misconception that psychoanalysis is only for the wealthy. In fact, Freud himself encouraged his colleagues to open outpatient clinics where analytic help could be available at little or even no cost to any man, woman, or child suffering psychological distress that interfered with their capacity or pleasure for play or work. Franz Alexander continued Freud's vision for what some have called altruistic analysis in establishing the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. The child adolescent clinical services have for decades now fulfilled the mission of providing high-quality mental health services to children, adolescents, and their families from the most diverse backgrounds, regardless of their ability to pay. We can all take great pride in knowing that the help they need is available here.
We had a really good time when I was director. I was director from 2004 to 2010. Continued to work out the implications of Heinz Kohut's ideas on self-psychology. I worked on, we had a number of conferences every year under the direction of Jim Anderson. On various topics that would be of interest both to psychoanalysts and to the public at large. One on Shakespeare, evil in Shakespeare, and another that I was particularly involved with was on fundamentalism. And this was part of the growing applications of self-psychology, not only to clinical matters, but outside and to applied matters in the real world. And I think that was very important then, and it continues to be important now. So there was growth of ideas, and a lot of productive work within that. We also tried to open our training to more people. We tried to bring people into training who were not necessarily in with training analysts at the time. That was a very controversial move nationally, so it was a good time. And I look forward to more creative time for the Institute and psychoanalysis. We are unique. We have a unique perspective, a unique tool, and a unique way of understanding human experience. That will never go out of fashion.
Psychoanalysis is something that often grabs the imagination of people when they're pretty young, late adolescence or so. That was certainly the case with me. Having the opportunity to learn, practice, and ultimately teach psychoanalysis is an incredible gift in our otherwise externally oriented world. There are very few institutions that foster a community where this is possible. The Chicago Institute is one of those very few places. Now, thanks to the expansion of our educational programs, this community is open to many more people, including younger people. Two initiatives in particular, our International Distance Learning Program and the First Year Fundamentals Program, which is our broad and intense introductory year, have been the backbone of this expansion. I'm proud to have been Associate Dean as these programs were getting off the ground, and I'm equally proud to continue teaching in these and other programs at the Institute.
Now, let me tell you about the exciting part of this evening's program. The Institute opened its doors in 1932. Depending on how you count, we were the third psychoanalytic institute established in the United States. Chicago has always been a part of our name, and we consider the greater Chicago area to be our home and community, even as technology has allowed us to broaden our borders. Tonight we have Paul DeRicca, a Chicago historian who will narrate the story of the Institute in the context of Chicago history. It is my great pleasure to introduce Paul and tell you a bit about his background. Paul has a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Michigan and a PhD in English Literature and Letters from the University of Chicago. Currently, he is the Director of Exhibitions at the Newberry Library, and previously held the post of Director of Exhibitions and Programs for Illinois Humanities, the state affiliate of the National Endowment of the Humanities. He co-edited the book, Chicago by Day and Night, A Pleasure Seeker's Guide to the Paris of America. You probably didn't know that Chicago was the Paris of America. This book is actually a reissue of a guide to the Chicago 1893 Columbian Exposition with annotations and introductions that helps make it legible to us today. In 2008, Paul founded the touring company called Pocket Guides to Hell. The name was taken from a comment made by a turn of the previous century labor leader from Britain commenting on Chicago, which we may or may not agree with. This tour company started with walking tours that illuminated aspects of Chicago history. Interest in this approach to history was such that Paul developed a series of historical reenactments and public history projects in conjunction with arts and culture organizations in Chicago. In the Kenwood neighborhood, for example, he started a walking tour based on the Leopold and Loeb 1926 murder case. He also conducted an extravagant reenactment of the Haymarket Square bombing in 1886 when workers went on strike for an 8-hour workday and other benefits. So perhaps Paul can best be described as a public historian, and I'd like to quote him more or less. He says, "The past should be regarded as public space. It belongs to all of us. The present is not a given. The present is a result of choices made and challenges met. We can't understand where we are and what it means and imagine possible futures if we don't know where we've been." Spoken like a true psychoanalyst, it is my pleasure to welcome Paul DeRicca.
Hello, I'm Paul DeRicca, Director of Exhibitions at the Chicago History Museum, and I'm here to take you back in time, 90 years, to the opening of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. What was Chicago like 90 years ago? How did the institution fit into the larger story of the city? So let's start back when the Institute opened on October 3rd, 1932. The first director of the Institute was Dr. Franz Alexander. The first associate director was Dr. Karen Horney. Both had studied in Berlin at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute. Both had been born in Europe at the end of the 19th century, and both had known Sigmund Freud. The Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute was unique in many ways. It was the second such institution to be established in the United States. It was the sixth such institute to be established in the world. Unlike a lot of the other institutes, the Chicago Institute was independent of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Society. It had a lay board of directors. Its chairman was Alfred K. Stern, pictured here on the left. Stern was manager of the Rosenwald Fund. He was the son-in-law of Julius Rosenwald, president of the Sears Roebuck Company, an early funder of the Institute. The Institute, though, also distinguished itself through its dedication to research and also by making psychoanalytic treatment available to a majority of Chicagoans. In order to be treated at the Institute, you only had to pay a nominal fee. So now, what was psychoanalysis like in the early 1930s in Chicago? And what role did the Institute play in popularizing it in the city? Well, when the Institute opened its doors at 43 East Ohio on October 3rd, 1932, many would have already been a little bit aware of Dr. Freud and his teachings. As Dr. Alexander said in a newspaper article that noted the opening, at that point in time, going to a psychoanalyst to have a mental issue treated was more or less the same as going to an ophthalmologist to have a problem with your eye treated. Now, this wasn't Alexander's first time in Chicago. He had actually been in the city a couple years prior. He had been invited to Chicago by the president of the University of Chicago, Robert Maynard Hutchins. Hutchins himself had become president of the university only a year prior to extending his invitation to Dr. Alexander, and at 30, he was the youngest president of a major educational institution in the United States. Hutchins was determined to be on the cutting edge of what was going on in various academic fields, and so while psychoanalysis hadn't been fully integrated into academic institutions by that point in time, Hutchins felt confident that Alexander would find a place of prominence and respect within the university's hospital system. Oddly enough, though, it was actually a lot of people in the social sciences and the humanities who would gravitate to Dr. Alexander's lectures. And they weren't all given just for faculty and students at the University of Chicago. Since the university's founding in the early 1890s, it had dedicated itself to kind of sharing the knowledge of its instructors with a wide array of Chicagoans. And you'll see pictured here on the left an advertisement from January of 1931, in which Dr. Alexander is giving a series of public talks on psychoanalysis at the Art Institute of Chicago. So, by the time that Dr. Alexander became director of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute in 1932, many people were kind of prepared for what he had to share and the treatments that the Institute had to offer. Now, where was the Institute located? As I mentioned, the doors opened on October 3rd, 1932. The quarters were modest. There was a library, a laboratory, a couple of consulting rooms, an auditorium, and a few classrooms, nothing more. And it was located at 43 East on Ohio, a building north of the Chicago River in a kind of growing area not too far from the Magnificent Mile, Michigan Avenue. The building the Institute called home, at 43 East Ohio, was the American Bankers Insurance Building. It stood 12 stories tall, and it had many tenants. Among its occupants were architects, and doctors, and lawyers, but also some other interesting businesses as well, which you'll see here in this slide. The Honeywell company had its sales offices based in the building. It's where you could go to buy and learn about the latest in thermostat technology. It's also where the offices were located for the Okie Dokie Popcorn Company. In case you're curious, that's a brand that still exists and is actually produced today by the same company that produces Jay's Potato Chips, another local Chicago favorite. And the building itself was active in advertising for tenants at that point in time. It was only 4 years old and was considered a very kind of modern office structure in a very attractive neighborhood. So with the Institute ideally situated, with a lay board in place made up of many prominent individuals, including the previously mentioned Alfred K. Stern, and a faculty on staff that consisted of not just Franz Alexander and Karen Horney, but also other figures like Thomas French and Margaret McLean. The Institute was ready to kind of welcome in its first students and its first patients. But what was Chicago like in October 1932? What was the world into which the Institute was entering? Well, if you were a Chicagoan living at that time and you picked up your Chicago Daily Tribune ready to kind of experience the day, you would have been able to read the Dick Tracy comic strip in which just a month prior, the Kid had been introduced. He would shortly become known as Tracy Jr. You would also learn about the weather. That day in October was unseasonably warm. It got up to about 80 degrees and had clear skies throughout. If you were interested in seeking out popular entertainment, you would learn that at the local theaters, some of which still exist today, such as the Music Box and the Davis Theater, as well as different theaters in the Loop, such as the Chicago, you could go and see films like the Marx Brothers' Horse Feathers, or pictured here, Grand Hotel, starring Greta Garbo and John Barrymore. But while these things were kind of important to the everyday life of Chicagoans, there were many other things happening both in the city and around the world that would have a profound impact on how people lived at that time. And in many ways, when we look back to October 1932, we see a world that is very kind of different from the one we inhabit today, but one that has kind of echoes of our own moment, suggesting that in many ways, while the city has changed profoundly, there are some things that have remained remarkably consistent and the same.
In my early teens, I discovered and read all of James Fenimore Cooper's novels. The story of his most popular novel, The Last of the Mohicans, has stayed with me. My memory of it was recently revived by this celebration of the 90th anniversary of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. My directorship, as I look back on it, represents a transitional point, an inflection point in our histories of the Institute. Just as cultural shifts impacted the place of the Native Americans in our country's development, I am the last in an unbroken, continuous line of MD psychoanalysts who have been directors. Major changes have been underway since my directorship concluded. My hope is that the storied history and remarkable contributions of our Institute will once again become notable and widely regarded as innovative. A vigorous development which revives the spirit of creativity and research contributions as a result of the vast changes in our structure would be a legacy I dream of witnessing.
In my mind, our clinical services are so important because they are what Erica often calls a demonstration project. We're teaching and training in the clinic, and we're putting into practice in the community what we are teaching. It allows us to offer to a diverse community a high-quality psychotherapy service at affordable rates. Personally, it was very gratifying to work with the clinic therapists, a group who are devoted to our mission and to lifelong learning. It was particularly exciting for me to launch our psychotherapy fellowship program, where we offer a more intensive training component within our clinic. Our graduates have gone on to become clinic therapists, to pursue full analytic training, and in at least one case, both. Within that program, one more thing that I was especially pleased to work on, through a generous gift from an angel, was to extend a scholarship to a clinician working in the public sector. We learned from her, she learned a lot from us, and she has brought our way of working and thinking into her community agency, where we hope it will spread. I know of no other entity like ours in the city and I hope that we will be able to continue this important work for years going forward.
Good evening. Throughout its history, the Chicago Institute has been a leader, recognizing that educating scholars contributes both to psychoanalysis and to scholarly disciplines. Graduates of similar programs, including Marvin Zonas, Bertram Kohler, Jonathan Lear, Bonnie Lidowitz, Mark Gehry, Wode Cracky, and Jeffrey Stern, brought psychoanalysis to their fields and their fields to psychoanalysis. When our program came on hard times for administrative reasons, I was invited to help revive it. We now have about a dozen students with backgrounds ranging from anthropology and philosophy to literary studies and law, an exciting group of people. It has been my privilege to play a role in building this, the Psychoanalysis for Scholars and Professionals program.
So what were some of the sort of top stories in the world and in the city at the time that the Institute opened on that third day of October 1932? Well, internationally, the world was in the midst of turmoil and violence. Japan had invaded part of China, specifically Manchuria, and was seeking to kind of increase its territorial claims. This met with resistance from the United States, and in fact, the United States Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, on the day that the Institute opened, delivered an address to the Philadelphia Union League Club, in which he called out Japan for its aggression and asked the League of Nations to support him in this call. This was met, understandably, by the Japanese as an act of hostility and further eroded the relationship between the United States and the Empire of Japan. Interestingly enough, while most members of the League of Nations opposed the aggressive maneuvers on the part of Japan to expand its territory, the empire did have an ally in France. But the events going on in Manchuria and even in Philadelphia to many Chicagoans seemed a world away. Much more locally, they were still dealing in October of 1932 with the effects of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the greatest economic crisis that the country had ever faced, resulting in record numbers of unemployment, countless businesses failed, people's livelihoods lost. Among those individuals who suffered as a result of the Great Depression was Samuel Insull. Now, Samuel Insull had been born in England in the late 1870s, but had come to the United States to be the personal secretary of Thomas Edison. Insull quickly worked his way up to become one of the leaders of Edison's various companies, and in 1892, just a year before the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, he moved to this city. Insull very quickly established various utility companies in the city, including companies that would eventually evolve into Commonwealth Edison. While Insull would have a series of financial successes throughout the early 20th century and also helped to build the contemporary electrical grid, the Depression impacted him just as it did many others, and he lost control over a lot of his companies. Worse still, he was accused of more or less profiting off of his investors, kind of inflating the value of the stock of his various companies in order so that he could sell it at a profit. Insull fled to France, expecting that he would not be extradited back to the United States. This ultimately would not be the case, and he would be returned to Chicago. But at that time, in early October 1932, the indictments had only just come down. His son, Samuel Insull Jr., had been requested to return to the United States to provide testimony, and Insull was still there with his wife in Europe. Coincidentally, his wife was 20 years his junior, a former stage actress, and it was partially because of her interest in the arts that Insull had, not many years prior, in 1929, helped to construct the Chicago Opera House, which exists to this day. Insel would eventually be forced to return to the United States in order to face trial for charges of wire fraud and larceny. But after a trial of a couple weeks, he would be acquitted of all charges. He would then return to Paris and die in 1938 while trying to board a metro train. His wife, aware that his health was failing, had attempted to convince him not to take public transit, but Insel was convinced that he was now a poor man and needed to use the train system. While these stories might have been dramatic and may have captured the attention of a lot of Chicagoans, there were other things going on that were much more immediate, even than Insel and his financial and legal problems. And the biggest thing that was happening in early October 1933 is that voters, not just in Chicago, but across the United States, were getting ready to elect potentially a new president. The presidential election of 1932 was just 5 weeks away, and both campaigns were gearing up to push for final outreach to voters. On the day that the Institute opened, October 3rd, 1932, the incumbent president, Republican Herbert Hoover's train pulled into Chicago around 7 a.m. Now, when I say pull into Chicago, I'm not being quite accurate. It would have expected pulled into Union Station, which you see pictured here. But because of security concerns around the president, instead the train pulled just a little bit short of the city, where it changed lines in order to head farther west to Des Moines, Iowa, where the president was scheduled to give a speech the following day. He decided that he would kick off a western leg of his trip in Iowa because that was where Hoover was from originally, and also because the Republican Party was concerned that states like Iowa, which had been solidly Republican since the 1850s, in fact, Iowa had voted for the first Republican presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, back in 1856, and had only gone to the Democrats one time since then in 1912, when Woodrow Wilson managed to carry the state because the Republican Party had been split between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Nonetheless, Republicans were concerned that this time in 1932, the native son and the incumbent president might lose that state. And not just that state, but other states across the Great Plains and the West Coast that had, to that point, been considered Republican strongholds. Now, Hoover didn't stop in Chicago because he knew that he wouldn't be met with a good reception there. Just a couple days prior to his arrival in the city, his Democratic opponent had been there as well. Franklin D. Roosevelt returned to Chicago on October 1st, 1932. He'd been there in late June to July that year at the Democratic National Convention to receive the nomination for president. Roosevelt was, at the time, the governor of New York, and he was promising a New Deal for the United States, an active set of policies that hopefully would lift the United States out of the Great Depression. Roosevelt was also interested in repealing the 18th Amendment, which had established national prohibition on intoxicating beverages. He returned in early October to Chicago, basically to rally support in the city and to solidify his relationship with Democratic leaders there, including Mayor Anton Cermak. Cermak had been elected the previous year in 1931 and had put together a coalition of various ethnic communities in Chicago to build what would eventually become the Democratic machine, which would dominate the city politics from the 1930s up through the present day. But on that day, October 1st, 1932, Roosevelt was a guest of the city. He would spend his evening at the Stevens Hotel, which was owned by the family of future Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens. There he would address 3,000 Democrats, and he would promise not only a New Deal for the country and the repeal of the Volstead Act, but also that in his policies he would remember the, quote, forgotten man, that is, the individual who'd been impacted by the Depression, but largely left aside by the United States government. Roosevelt's speech was broadcast over the air on WGN radio. In fact, they even put speakers out in Grant Park so that more interested Chicagoans could hear what the Democratic nominee had to say. After delivering his speech, Roosevelt traveled by car to the fairgrounds of what would be the 1933 and 1934 Century of Progress World's Fair. Roosevelt promised that if he were elected president that November, he would be back in Chicago the following spring to open the World's Fair properly.
14 years ago, CPI took psychoanalysis into the community, specifically to children exposed to violence in our city. Psychoanalysis works with the mechanics of repetition in cycles of violence, and we witness again and again how children can find within themselves the capacity to transform what's at stake in violence into a form that can serve them better. An 8-year-old boy whose father is incarcerated for homicide was referred to us this year because he rages in the classroom, throws chairs, yells at his teacher, and takes flight. In one of our recent group meetings, we asked, "What is a human?" And he drew a picture of a man made up of the mathematical symbols for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. He used his picture to explain why he'd stormed out of the previous meeting and said, it was about a human being divided up. As a first step, this boy was able to imagine what no one else could imagine in his place and to put into words how he felt. This enabled him to create his own way of understanding what no one else can understand in his place. The school communities we have been working with over these years teach us what is needed from a psychoanalysis of the 21st century, and we try to listen and to invent the next step together.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at the benefit this year about the child therapy program. When I graduated from graduate school, I was encouraged by my professors, Judith Mishney and Dr. Boris Galansky, who were part of the Chicago Institute, to become part of and join the child therapy program, especially if I was going to be a child psychotherapist. So I went out immediately and started my analysis and became a student in the CAP program. After many years, I was asked to become director, along with Barry Childress, of the child therapy program, and I felt privileged and honored to have that opportunity. At that time, the child therapy program, or CAP, was really seen as a satellite program of the Institute. And with the reorganization of the Institute at that time, Barry Childress and I felt it was a good opportunity to begin to integrate and bring the child and adolescent psychotherapy program into a closer relationship with the Institute's family. So we joined together the graduations from the various programs, helped set up workshops that were produced by the child therapy program and the child analysis committee, and we helped members of the CAP faculty to become active with the various administrative committees at the Institute and to come on and become part of the CAP faculty and part of the Institute faculty as a whole. CAP has transformed over the years into the PPP program, and now remains a unique and outstanding training program for child therapists at the Institute, in Chicago, and really around the world. So I look forward to continuing to be part of that program. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. About 10 to 15 years ago, there began some exciting collaborations between child and adult analysis at our institute. Child analysis can dramatically enhance the lives of children and their parents. Child work can also help us understand the childhood antecedents of our adult patients. Two areas benefited. First, in education, students could take a child case toward graduation from the adult program. And second, in the clinical arena, there were increased services for children. Many people contributed to these advances. First, David Turman and Mike Hoyt were essential to the educational developments. And second, Joan and Bill Dutton were key to increase services for children, adolescents, and their parents. Thank you very much.
Earlier that afternoon, the Democratic nominee for president, Franklin Roosevelt, and the mayor of the city of Chicago, Anton Cermak, had gone to the ballpark, to Wrigley Field on Chicago's north side, to catch a game. And it wasn't just any game. Keep in mind, this is October. It was a World Series game. The Chicago Cubs were playing the New York Yankees. Roosevelt, as the governor of New York, was understandably rooting for the Yankees. And Cermak, well, he came from what is today the Little Village neighborhood on the city's west side, and most likely was a Chicago White Sox fan, nonetheless was there to support his home team. Now, this game was one that would end up entering not just Chicago lore, but baseball lore as well. Up to that point, the Yankees were doing extremely well. They had won the first 2 games in New York against the Cubs, but some expected that with the Cubs back on their home field, they would offer a bigger challenge. But what happened in that game was something that no one anticipated. Now, I'm going to tell you the legend. With the score tied 4-4 in the top of the 5th, George Herman Babe Ruth took to the plate against the Cub pitcher, Charlie Root. After taking a first strike, Ruth purportedly pointed directly to the center field fence, indicating that he would knock Root's next pitch over the fence. Instead, it ended up being strike 2. Not impacted in the least, Ruth once again pointed out to the center field fence, saying that the next pitch would end up going over it. And sure enough, when Ruth threw the ball, Ruth connected, and that pitch traveled over 440 feet over the center field fence, very close to the flagpole pictured in the slide that one sees here, with the Cubs flag on top of it. This was the calling of the shot, which would become a baseball legend. As Ruth rounded home plate, he would be greeted by fellow Yankee legend Lou Gehrig, who would give him a playful pat on the butt. And what couldn't be disputed is that the Yankees were now in the lead and would go on to win Game 3 of the World Series. Now, what actually happened? Eyewitness accounts vary. Among them is an account provided by John Paul Stevens, whose family owned the hotel where the Democratic nominee, Governor Roosevelt, would give his address that evening. In his memoir, written after he was a Supreme Court justice, Stevens would swear that from where he was, he could see Ruth pointing out at the center field fence, that he did indeed call his shot. Others would dispute this, and even the filmed footage that would emerge decades later offers conflicting perspectives. But what is known is that sports writers seized upon the story and soon began to spread it. And Ruth himself, who was not shy about publicity, quickly embraced the narrative, so much so that it turns up in his own autobiography and in later films made about his life. Charlie Root, the Cubs pitcher, understandably remembers it differently. According to him, he and his teammates had been harassing Ruth up to that point in the World Series, and Ruth was simply talking back at them and reminding Root that he still had a couple strikes left before his at-bat was over. But whatever the case, Babe Ruth calling his shot became a baseball legend. And there to witness it were Franklin Roosevelt, Anton Cermak, the future Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, and thousands of other Chicagoans. Now, the next day, the Cubs would go on to lose again. They would end up being swept in 4 straight games by the New York Yankees. This would be the 4th World Series loss in a row for the Chicago Cubs, and they would experience 3 more World Series losses before finally winning in 2016. Regardless of whether or not Babe Ruth called his shot, the Yankees would go on to win that game 7-5, and then the following day, October 2nd, 1932, they would sweep the series, crushing the Cubs by a score of 13-4. That night, many of them would board a train, and perhaps their train on its way back to New York passed President Hoover's train on its way to Chicago. So that was what was going on that October 3rd, 1932. Globally, the world was concerned about what was going on in Manchuria and the expansion of Japanese aggression. More locally, a prominent figure like Samuel Insull was on the verge of getting indicted. The city and the nation were preparing to elect a new president in the midst of the Great Depression. And Chicagoans who happened to be Cubs fans were feeling depressed in their own right after seeing their home team lose 4 straight games.
After the resignation of George Pollack as director of the Institute underwent a complete reorganization, striving for a more democratic outcome. For the first time, the director and the dean were elected by the faculty. I was elected dean for a 7-year duration. My first task was to help organize the Candidates Association that was at the time in disarray. Working closely with the association's president, I arranged a number of changes to speed up the time of graduation, including the lowering of the cases required from 4 to 3. My interests focus on educational issues, both in practice and research. I instituted the Evaluation of Learning Committee, highly successful study group adopted by other institutes, but regrettably recently discontinued. I also promoted the creation of the local fellowship program and supported the ongoing psychotherapy program. The Educational Research Committee, still ongoing, published 2 important papers on graduates' follow-up. Another important initiative was the study group on neuroscience and psychoanalysis, with the participation of neurology scholars from the University of Illinois. Members of this group are now leaders of neuropsychoanalysis. During my tenure, we were visited by members of the Committee of Institutes from the Board of Professional Standards of APSA. Their feedback recognized of our efforts as a leading psychoanalytic educational institute in the country.
I inherited the country's very first standalone childhood grief center. We are nationally known because of the awards we have received, the research we've conducted, and the articles we have written. We are still one of the few psychoanalytic standalone childhood grief centers. We developed a model for treating individual children who are grieving in schools. We are seen as one of the very best internship programs in the city of Chicago. Many students seek us because of our psychoanalytic orientation. But most of all, Bar Harris was the Institute's first program to go into the communities. Bar Harris' expertise in childhood grief has led to many projects. For example, we have worked with children of fallen soldiers. We have worked with children who have incarcerated mothers. A child was murdered who was part of a project at the Museum of Science and Industry. The museum asked us to come and reach out to children involved in the project and their mothers. We have done school programs and library programs for the Chicago Public Library, and we have also worked with their staff to help them understand the effects of childhood grief. The knowledge and expertise that we have learned has led to a storybook about a little girl coping with the COVID pandemic. Bar Harris is a gem and represents the best of the Institute.
Coming from a background in community mental health practice and psychodynamic studies, I'm proud to be a part of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute Treatment Center, as it is a place where both come together. Since starting as the Treatment Center Director in January 2021, I have seen our psychoanalytic psychotherapy services stretch and adapt to meet the growing needs of our community. With most widely available programs focusing on quick fix treatments and progress quantified in numbers and behaviors, it feels especially important to work to increase access to high-quality, long-term, depth-oriented therapy services such as ours. I am especially proud at how the treatment center continues to work to increase access to psychodynamic psychotherapy in our community by partnering with Chicago Public Schools to provide therapy in schools where it is desperately needed, and by expanding our fellowship and internship training programs to nurture the next generation of psychodynamic psychotherapists to continue this important work.
The Institute would stay at its home at 43 East Ohio for the next 15 years, but then some significant changes started to happen. The biggest change was, of course, leaving its home at the American Bankers Insurance Building for a new home at the Farwell Building, considered an architectural masterpiece. The Farwell Building was actually a little bit older than the American Bankers Insurance Building, but was located right on Michigan Avenue. And when the Institute moved in April of 1947, it was able to take over 3 floors within that building, a sign of the growing success of the Institute, its expanding faculty, its expanding student body, and the larger number of patients that it could treat. Not long after that, Dr. Alexander prepared for his own departure, and he would end up agreeing to go and take a position at Mount Sinai in California in 1956. As the first director, Alexander had a profound impact on the Institute and its identity. He was, on one hand, a traditional and somewhat conservative figure who embraced the teachings of Sigmund Freud, but wasn't afraid to look beyond them and to also embrace new techniques and new ideas. He managed to hold together a staff and faculty that consisted of individuals of wildly varying opinions and approaches and still present a more or less unified whole. His first associate director, Dr. Karen Horney, had lasted only a year and had left Chicago for New York in 1934. She was soon replaced by Thomas French. In the interim, between 1932 and 1947, other key figures like Therese Benedict and Helen Ross had joined the staff of the Institute. If it's not clear by now, women had always played an important role at the Institute, both as staff and as students. Now, I just want to stick with the history of the building for a brief moment. As I mentioned, the Farwell Building is an architectural masterpiece that still exists to this day. You can go on Michigan Avenue and find it. But the same cannot be said of the Institute's first home, 43 East Ohio, the American Bankers Insurance Building. In the early 1960s, the American Red Cross would purchase the building and make it its headquarters, which it would remain for several decades. But redevelopment would eventually catch up with that part of the city, and the building would be torn down in 1998. Now, before I leave the year 1932, I want to go back to one story and tease out one thread which is interesting, a kind of association that one might not expect with the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute and its long and complicated history. Now, as I mentioned, the first president of the board was Alfred K. Stern. Alfred K. Stern was associated with the Rosenwald Fund and the son-in-law of one of Julius Rosenwald's daughter. But eventually, Stern divorced Rosenwald's daughter and left the Rosenwald Fund and moved to New York. And there, in 1938, he met Martha Dodd. Martha Dodd had spent some time in Chicago because her father was William E. Dodd, chair of the Department of History at the University of Chicago. He had taught there since 1908. But in June of 1933, he would be nominated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to be the ambassador to Germany, representing the United States in Berlin. There, he would become a first-hand witness of the rising horrors and atrocities committed by the Nazi Party in power in Germany. Dodd's experiences would later be recounted in a nonfiction book by Erik Larson, In the Garden of the Beasts, published in 2011. Erik Larson, of course, is best known to Chicagoans as the author of The Devil in the White City, a book about the World's Clumbing Exposition and the serial killer H.H. Holmes. Now, Alfred K. Stern's story, though, doesn't end there in the 1930s with his marriage to Martha Dodd. Instead, he and Martha, both impacted by the events of the 1930s, would become involved more and more with the Communist Party in the United States and establish a relationship with the Soviet Union and Russia. So much so, they would actually begin to spy for the Russians, although with limited success. By the mid-1950s, they would be forced to flee the United States before they could be prosecuted, settling in Prague in 1956, the same year that Franz Alexander would leave the Institute to take his new position in California. And so in a strange way, there was a kind of return. Many of the first members of the staff at the Institute had fled Europe, particularly Eastern Europe and Germany, to escape various forms of persecution, including up through the 1930s with the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. And here, in the 1950s, the very first president of the Institute's board instead was heading back to Eastern Europe, where he and Martha Dodd would settle in Prague, and they would live there until his death in 1986 and her death in 1990. So I hope you've enjoyed our trip back 90 years in time to when the Institute first opened in October 1932. It was a city and a world in many ways very different from ours, and yet a lot of the anxieties that Chicagoans were feeling resemble our own. And yet, in the intervening 90 years, the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute has been here. It's been here to train new analysts, to help those in need, and to help us all make sense of our world.
We of the current Child Analytic Training Program are the heirs to child analytic investigations that began in Berlin and Vienna in the 1920s and crystallized into a formal training at the Chicago Institute in the 1940s. In its contemporary iteration, we gather together candidates from around the world and try to convey to our students the exhilarating, frightening, exciting, astonishing ways in which children think, feel, and communicate. We on the faculty hope that our love and enjoyment of children and our devotion to psychoanalytically inspired exploration of the early development of mind come together in our teaching. Children usually come to us psychoanalytic clinicians embedded in families, and so we usually begin with parents. We try to help our students appreciate the privilege of coming close to the intimate interior of family lives, of becoming aware of the conscious and unconscious emotional patterns, of seeing how both the children's and their parents' personalities are taking shape in the crucible of family life. We focus on the interplay of internal factors, the child's and the parent's temperament, their individual capacities for tolerating anxieties, expressing emotions, and so on, and the external and contingent factors, matters of emotional and financial support for the family, community issues of containment versus disruption, etc. We understand that in order to learn, students need a protected space for grappling with all this. We try to provide this in our seminars and supervisions. Our candidates are referred children of all ages. Many of these children are very distressed and disturbed. As we support the candidates in engaging in an intensive 3 to 5 times per week analytic experience with the children, the candidates bring to us, the faculty, the intensity of their own reactions and their bewilderment about what often seems to the student to be shapeless chaos in the children's presentation. We find that if we as teachers can help the candidates find meaningful links which render the children's behavior understandable, this reduces the degree of confusion, anxiety, and persecution, and frees the candidate's imagination and hopefulness. And we also know and teach that students need to engage with the wider community of teachers and schools and other professionals who share our responsibility and concern with supporting development. As our job is to encourage and support our candidates' development, so we hope that they can go on to support and encourage the development of the children and families who come into their care. And eventually, we know that the candidate will be ready to go off on his or her own and function as independent child psychoanalysts in the community.
Hi, I'm Ed Kaufman. In celebrating the Institute's 90th anniversary, I want to thank the Institute, the child psychoanalytic faculty, for their pioneering support in establishing the Child and Adolescent Psychotherapy Training Program, affectionately known as CAT, in 1962. It was the first such program of its type in the country. I toast our faculty for their unstinting generosity in teaching and supervising our students. And we congratulate all of our graduates, many of whom have become leaders in the field of child and adolescent psychotherapy, and many of whom have joined us as members of our faculty. I'm proud of CAP's contribution to the Chicago metropolitan community. And in the course of training, our students provided psychotherapy to more than 650 children and adolescents and their families from a wide variety of backgrounds and a variety of treatment settings as well. And they provided 3,800 diagnostics evaluations. Students have traveled from Europe, Italy, Germany, and across the country to take classes in person at the CAP program. In recent years, with the advent of distant learning, we've had students from Brazil, Mexico, Utah, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, and with the integration of CAP into the PPP program, students from China have come to learn child and adolescent psychotherapy as well.
Thank you, Paul, for this very interesting journey of our Institute's history in Chicago's history. And also thank you to Kurash Dini for contributing his original music, again, to our benefit this evening. I'd like to give a little overview of what CPI has done in its 90th anniversary year. Our country is experiencing a mental health crisis, and it certainly is present in Chicago as well. And we really need to have as many of our therapists as possible serving our patients in the treatment center, and we need to be able to work in the schools, and we need to be able to train clinicians so everybody's up to the task in this work of psychoanalysis. So we appreciate everything that you could possibly give to our cause today, and I want to share with you some of the things that we have done this past year. For example, this Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute has 7 programs, 121 classes, 1,093 hours of instruction for 133 students. 50% of them are local and 38% international, 20% national, just all over the country. Our treatment center this year treated 143 patients for 7,838 hours. And we also had our special program, our Pandemic Frontline Responders program, where we had 44 faculty volunteers. We had 60 inquiries, and there were 47 individuals who were served. And we worked up to 8 hours pro bono with each of those responders. So our institute has done a lot, and we've continued to do it with your help, and we hope that you will also help today. You know, this is a unique time for our institute. Our president for 9.5 years, Erica Schmidt, is retiring as of October 1st, and we are interviewing now for a new president. It's been a long time. We're introduced a new curriculum. There's been a lot of changes at the Institute that we think have brought us up to a very contemporary place, and yet holding to the traditions of psychoanalysis as well. And, you know, new times bring up trepidation, but also hope and excitement and a surge of energy that can move us forward. We have a new chief development officer. We have a new marketing officer, an officer for operations. We have a growing CPI board that's much more diverse, not only in ethnicity and race composition, but also in professions. We want to expand to have more people on the board who would be more likely to understand the population who uses our services. Today, any donation that you'd like to give in honor of our 90th anniversary, you can also make it in honor of a person who you feel has made a contribution to the Institute, or you can do it also in memory of someone whose contributions to the Institute have made a difference to you. And those will be acknowledged in our newsletter and on our website. So whenever I realize it's the Institute's 90th anniversary, I go, oh my gosh, it's almost 100. And that's only 10 short years away. But we are going to need your help to get there. So please click the donation button on your screen or send a check to the address on your screen, and we would appreciate it very much.
I was interested in bringing my prior administrative experience to my term as Dean of the Institute. Erica and other leaders had identified several problem areas that needed modernization, in particular admissions, assessment, and curriculum. We streamlined the admissions procedures and made them more transparent and objective. Similarly, assessments were streamlined and made annual rather than waiting sometimes several years for candidates to reach a point of assessment. The curriculum was, a new curriculum was designed that filled some important holes, including psychoanalysis in the community, diversity, and more international perspectives. And we were able to decrease the required number of years of training for psychoanalytic candidates from 5 to 4, and consolidated our 2 psychotherapy programs, child and adult, into one program. I'm very impressed with the Institute community for tolerating this amount of change in 1 year, and I think it positions us well to move forward confidently.
It was my dream to study psychoanalysis at an old school institute. Psychoanalysis, one word, one theory, one way of thinking. But needs of individuals and institutions change, and our institute has transitioned many times in its 90 years. As an active faculty member since 2005, I've had the privilege of being a participant observer for recent changes. Now our curriculums include multiple contemporary and classic theories, but also address what clinicians need to know to work in our challenging times and diverse settings. Students from around the world have joined us, welcoming us into their consulting rooms and cultures. This very welcome transition adds new colleagues and new voices to our community. Of course, we've all faced the big pandemic transition. 4 couch hours are now more or less 4 hours wherever Wi-Fi or cell service works. For an old school institute, we have certainly been creatively adaptable and better for it. But for me, there is something about psychoanalysis that will never transition, and that is respect for the power of the unconscious, transference, lifespan development, and for the life-changing power of the empathic therapeutic relationship.
Now I'd like to introduce David Schiffman, our CPI board chair, who's going to give the closing remarks. Thank you.
I want to thank Paul Durica for that wonderful presentation. It was really special. I want to thank our board. I want to thank our faculty. They're the backbone of the Institute. It's their help that makes everything work. I want to thank our candidates. They're the future of the Institute. I want to thank the alumni. A program like this requires a great deal of effort, and so special thanks have to go to our development committee, our benefit committee, and the members of the staff who have put in countless hours to bring this together. On the financial side, I want to thank all of our guests, all of our donors, including some who have been giving for more than 25 years. You know who you are. That's really important. And I want to thank our sponsors for this evening's program. Let me remind everyone that there is still time to donate by clicking on that button that you see on the screen that says donate. Every little bit helps, and hopefully more than a little bit. So everyone, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you very much.